think I said at the beginning that, but I'll say it again. There were several things that led to my talk today. One of them, it started with a conversation with a friend, and that really got me thinking. And another thing that became a part of it is a book that I read recently and was able to share with some people over a period of time called The 5 Invitations. And there's one particular invitation in that book. If you haven't read it yet, it's by Frank Ostaseski, and it's just, I just love that book. And then the third piece that led to this talk is this inquiry of how do we listen when it's difficult? How do we listen when we don't want to listen? So this month, right, we're spending 8 months basically going through and looking at the Eightfold Path. And so far, we've looked at right view and we've looked at right action. And this month, we're looking at right speech. And I think of listening, deep listening, compassionate listening as an integral part of right speech. And so even before I go into talking about what right speech is, I'll share this little bit of a passage from Mary Oliver. She is speaking about her partner after her partner died. Her partner was a beautiful photographer. And when she died, they had been together, I think, like 40 years or something. And the great loves of each other's lives, just such a beautiful love affair. And Mary Oliver was talking about her partner, and in this, she calls her M. But she says, when I was watching M, when she was taking photographs and watching her in the dark room, and no less watching the intensity and the openness with which she dealt with friends and strangers too, that taught me what real attention is about. Attention without feeling, I began to learn, is only a report. An openness and empathy was necessary if the attention was to matter. I, Mary Oliver is speaking, who was a poet, right? I was eager to address the world of words, to address the world with words. Then M instilled in me this deeper level of looking and working, of seeing through the heavenly visibles to the heavenly invisibles. I love that last line, the heavenly visibles to the heavenly invisibles. I think for me, it speaks to what deep listening really is. You know, it's so I get ahead of myself. So even before that, let me go back to what right speech is. Right speech comes up a lot in the Buddha's teachings. It comes up in the Eightfold Path, yes, but it also comes up as one of the 5 precepts, these way of gifts. Thich Nhat Hanh calls them the 5 gifts. And these 5 gifts are protecting life, right? This is when we go on retreat and we see that everyone is taking the spiders and putting them outside rather than squashing them. And then we do that back at home too, right? Protecting all forms of life, taking only what's freely offered, using our sexual energy in a way that doesn't harm people, refraining from using intoxicants to the degree that they could cloud judgment, and right speech. So there it is in the 5 precepts. We often take those precepts sometimes in life. I know Lee took them on for, I think, 6 years, right, Lee, where you just lived by these precepts. And then often at retreat, we're asked to take these precepts on. In the Noble Eightfold Path, right speech comes as part of a trilogy. So right action, right speech, and right livelihood are part of this Eightfold Path that go together. And what does right speech even mean? So if we go by the very formal language of the Buddha, right, the Buddha says, he asks, right, he says, what is right speech? I can just hear this voice, right, in my head. What is right speech? Abstaining from lying, from divisive speech, from abusive speech, and from idle chatter, from gossip. This is called right speech, the Buddha says. So in layman's terms, right, if we're looking at what right speech is, that would be say what is true, say what is helpful, say what's necessary, and say it in the right context. That last one, that's a tricky one for me. And so I think of right speech when we think about listening. You know, right speech, I think of words, right? But I wanted to talk about listening because for me, the listening is really hard. Even though I spend my life as a therapist, right? As a psychologist, if I'm in session, listening is fairly easy. But in day-to-day life, you know, I can often want my words to get out there. And so I think about what is deep, compassionate listening. And I go back to Mary Oliver. Attention without feeling is only a report. And openness and empathy is necessary if attention is to matter. So what does that mean in terms of listening? There's a mindfulness teacher in the Hamden area, and the way that she says it, her name is Beth Roth, which some of you might know because she does a lot of different things around the area. She says deep listening means attending to our physical sensations, our thoughts, our emotions, as well as to the voice, facial expressions, gestures, pauses, underlying meanings, and the rich nuances that accompany the spoken words of others. So it's like listening with our whole being. That's deep listening. That's what I find so challenging sometimes, often, not sometimes, often, when I'm not in a session with a client. And I feel like it's easy to practice deep listening for me. I can only speak for myself. It's easy for me to practice it when I like what I'm hearing. You know, when my husband and I are agreeing on the same thing, I can listen to him, no problem, right? But what about when I disagree with what the other person is saying? Or what about, and this goes back to the 5 invitations, which is truly a book all about death, but also all about how can you live more fully? That's really the premise of the entire book. How can you live more fully before you die? So what about when someone is talking to us and what they're saying is so painful to us that we want to speak to stop them? We want to speak to stop our own hurting. And there's this really beautiful man I know. I've known him for about 3 years. And I would go to see him every once in a while in his apartment, and his apartment was really cramped. It was dark and it was stale, you know, it was kind of underground and there wasn't a lot of ventilation there. And it was not a really comfortable place to be. And this man suffers a lot. And he's got this beautiful soul, and he suffers. And he has this wicked addiction to smoking, and he's got COPD at the same time. So he's on oxygen, right? On and off, he's on oxygen, and yet he still smokes. And so I came to visit him one time, and he had all these burns all over his face. And turns out that the oxygen and his cigarette had a bad interaction, and he got burned, you know, fire. And it scared me so much. And it scared him enough that for a period of time, he stopped smoking. And I was so relieved because I really, you know, I care for him. And then about a year ago, maybe it's almost a year now, his brother died, and he wasn't on speaking terms with his brother. And one of his wishes was to speak to his brother before he died, to like bury the hatchet, to come to peace. And so it didn't happen because his brother would never answer his calls. And so there his brother dies, and he gets word of it. And of course, he starts smoking again because he's in so much pain. And I went to visit him, and as I was sitting across from him, and the room smelled like smoke, and all these memories were coming up for me of what it was like to live with someone who smoked really heavily. And that wasn't even the pain, right? The pain was that this man had just lost his brother without being able to say goodbye. And I was having a really, really hard time holding his pain. I think I could feel my heart just like knocking at my chest. And I remember as he was talking, I could barely hear him because I was thinking about everything else in the world except his pain. I was thinking about how he shouldn't be smoking, and he's going to kill himself, and doesn't he know what he's doing to himself? Everything except being with him in his pain. And I felt, and even when I still talk about it, it's not something I share very often, but when I left there, I felt so much shame at not being able to fully be there with him. And I know that he could feel it, because a person can really feel when we're with them or when we're not. One of the things that Frank Ostaseski says in his book is dukkha arises from ignorance, from forgetting that everything is impermanent, unreliable, and ungraspable. And as I was sitting with this beautiful man who was suffering so much, I did not want to think about that he was going to die. I didn't want to think about that I was going to lose him at some point, and it was beyond my stopping it. There's nothing I can do. That his life is impermanent, and that I'll be separated from him, and that he was going through that as well. Frank talks about his own denial, and how in denial, until we know denial, until we see through the denial, it will always be the bane of our existence. It will always be a cause of suffering. And that we must let go of our opposition to an experience that we're trying to avoid, whatever that experience is. And he talks about an experience that he had with parents who lost a son, young. I think he was like under 10 years old, so a young son, right? That's the unimaginable loss. And they wanted their son to be in his bed for a little bit. They wanted to let him rest before they came in, you know, anyone came and got him. And so they called Frank to come be with them and help them. And so he went there. And he said, what he was saying about them, he said, well, they've cared with him for great love and attention. Nobody had touched the boy since he had died. And it wasn't the fear of the corpse that kept them away. It was the fear of the grief that touching this boy might unleash. Right? This is the same thing as touching anything that is difficult, being with anybody's suffering, because we have to then also be with our own suffering. And so when Frank went over and kissed this boy's forehead, it allowed the parents to touch him as well. And they made this beautiful ritual and washed his body from head to toe. And when the mother got to the face of her child, she embraced him. And the way Frank talks about it is how she turned so tenderly towards her suffering. And as she touched it, that contraction that she had been feeling, that resistance of, I can't feel this, she was able to let it in, and that contraction melted. And I think that washing of the body is a beautiful example of mindful listening, right? It's like, I imagine it as this dance. And there's this intention, right, that we have to, that we all make to turn towards. So this man who I adore, his body continues to shut down. He's got lots of different illnesses. And I've made it my intention to be there more genuinely for him than I was before. And so we talk about death often, how he wants his death to go, what he wants to happen to his body afterwards, how he's preparing for his family so that they're okay when he goes. What are the last things? What he wants to know more than anything is what his purpose is in life, why he's here. And he's like, I'm still here because I haven't figured it out yet. And there was one day where he was talking to me. He's in the hospital a lot, and he had called me from the hospital, and he was talking about these people at the hospital. And it occurred to me that his reason for being is, I don't even know if I can put it into words, but in the moment that he and I were speaking, there's this incredible gift. Like, people are just nice to him because he's so nice to them. Like, it's this warmth that happens. So here are all these people that he didn't know in the hospital, and they're taking such good care of him. And I said to him, this is your purpose here. You're spreading this love. This is a purpose that you have. So Thich Nhat Hanh, I really love how he describes deep listening. He calls it compassionate listening. And if you've listened to Thich Nhat Hanh, see if you can hear his lilt, his accent, even though I'm saying it. You listen with only one purpose: help them to empty their heart. And if you remember that you're helping them to suffer less, then even if what they say is full of wrong perceptions, full of bitterness, you are still capable to listen with compassion. Because you know that listening like that with compassion, you give them a chance to suffer less. If you want to help them correct their perception, then you wait for another time. I love that. It's not that you're not going to say something at some point, but you will allow them the space. But for the time being, you just listen with compassion and help them to suffer less. And that's what I didn't do when I came back and this beautiful man had picked up smoking and I was having such a hard time listening to him. All I wanted to tell him to do was how his smoking was going to kill him. What help is that, right? That's like hurtful. And yet I guess it's through these contrasts, right? Of making the mistakes, of having to repair, that we can find our way perhaps to moments of compassionate listening. None of us is going to do it perfect. I certainly don't. I mean, that's a good example. One of my teachers, she really likes Byron Katie. I don't know if some of you have read Byron Katie, but Byron Katie is really big on saying we are not meant to tell anyone how to do anything. And the way my teacher talks about it is she says, if we bypass the responsibility of knowing what's happening in our own being, right? That's the deep listening that Beth Roth is talking about. What's happening in my own being as you're telling me you're suffering will be misattuned if we're not paying attention, right? That's what was happening to me when I couldn't hold my friend's suffering. We've all been in that place of feeling like we have to fix and saying something that doesn't actually need to be said. And we can feel that contraction when it happens, right? And there's the loop of how deep listening and right speech are connected. Because if we're listening into our bodies, into what's happening in our sensations and in our emotions, then we're going to know whether we stay silent and allow that person space. So my teacher goes on to say, she says, we need to stay honest about our inner emotional and energetic movements. What is my motivation? Do I want to keep you from being unhappy? If I try to take responsibility for your happiness, I'm saying you can't do this for yourself. I don't trust you to find your own way. And I think that's why I felt the shame when my friend was talking, right? Because it was as if I was saying, you can't find your own way. I know it better.